Hi, and welcome again to the TU Law Show. My name is Marty Belsky. I'm the Dean of the University of Tulsa College of Law. And we have today a very distinguished guest. His name is Aaron Levine, and he's in town. I'd like to say he's in town for us, for the show, but in fact he's in town to give a talk to the Jewish community on Sunday morning and also to visit his daughter, who lives in Tulsa. But he has a very interesting background and experience. He's worked for a number of years for Federated Department Stores, but that's not why we're going to be here talking about it. He's received various awards and had a very illustrative career with philanthropic issues. But let me get some of your background. Where were you born?
Boston, Mass.
Okay, and I know you've lived in lots of different places. Why don't you tell us some of the places you lived at?
Well, I grew up in Brookline, right outside of Boston. I went to grammar school and high school there. Then I went to Harvard College and got my bachelor's in 1940 and a master's in 1941. And then after a year or two, I went off to the war. And,
let's get into that. Let's take a few seconds. Where did you work during the war? What part of the...
I was assigned to military intelligence.
Army intelligence?
Army military, G2.
And what kind of things did you do?
Well, while there was a war going on, our job was to obtain military information, mostly strategic. Where were the divisions? Where were the Germans? Where were they placed? What was going on behind the lines? And what was happening in our own controlled area, which had some bearing upon the war.
Now, how did you get involved in military intelligence?
Well, it was all luck and chance. I had studied French and German in high school. In college, graduate school, I had passed graduate exams in both languages. I was fluent in the sense I could read and write both languages, but I had never lived in France or a German-speaking country, so I had to learn to speak that. But when I was inducted into the service in 1943 at Camp Devens in Massachusetts, the interviewer asked me about languages, and he put down that I was fluent. And I explained to him what my fluency consisted of. Well, after I was at Fort Custer in Battle Creek, Michigan, taking basic training in the military police, while I was digging a foxhole one day, I was told to report Class A uniform to battalion headquarters, where a captain ushered me in. At that point, I was a buck private. And he ushered me in and called me Mister. No one had called me Mister for some time. And said, are you interested in intelligence? I said, yes, sir. My antennae were immediately quivering. He says, well, they want you. I said, wonderful. He says, you'll leave here the day after tomorrow, and here's your Pullman tickets to go to Camp Ritchie in Maryland. But you're not to tell anybody. My wife was in town, staying in Battle Creek. She was teaching. And when I got a pass that evening, I think it was, and when I crept into bed that night, I said to her, we're getting the hell out of here.
All right. I mean, military intelligence can be very, very broad. What kind of a unit were you attached to?
I was attached to 7th Corps, which is part of 1st Army.
And where is this? Where were they located?
Well, they were located first in Aachen. That's when I caught up with them. You know, I was in a French team first. My French was better than my German. And we had a lot of German speakers who were fluent in German, who would come from Germany, and it was thought that I'd be better off in French. And my accent was good. I was always a good speaker of languages. That came easy to me. And but I ran into a ditch on the way to the invasion, running a Jeep. And I ran into a ditch and broke my arm and banged myself up and spent the next couple of months in a hospital near Cheltenham, in the Cotswold area and of England. Then I finally got out, was moved up to Birmingham Reppel Depot Replacement Depot, and then got back to my outfit in London sometime in September, and then transferred back to Levine in French, where the military intelligence unit was settled, the headquarters for military intelligence, which at that time consisted of linguists and interpreters like myself.
And what year is this?
This is now 1944, September 44. Paris had fallen. So when I arrived back at my outfit to take up my job as an interpreter in France, they said, we don't need you anymore in France. we're going to move you to Germany. I said, but, I said, no, you'll love it.
So you went to Germany? That's how
I
you
was
wound up-
transferred to a German team consisting of 2 officers and 4 men, all of whom were supposed to speak German fluently. And we arrived in Aachen, Kodeli Munster, actually.
This
a
is
little
still
town.
44? This is still
44. This is September. This is now probably October of 44. And we were on the Siegfried Line. We had not entered Germany yet. As a matter of fact, we were in Belgium, but if you recall what happened after that, the Germans broke through in the Battle of the Bulge.
Right.
We were moved back precipitously, starting at midnight, just before Christmas in December of 44, back to a town called Marsch, which is just on the furthest point where the Germans came. And at that point, we were doing work with suspected spies. We did some work with some terrible tragedies that had been caused by the Nazis who had murdered some people in some
Well,
of the
we're going to get to that
Belgian
in a second. I
towns.
want to get,
Yeah.
but did you have a special assignment in Germany?
My special assignment was yes and no. While the war was going on, we were interviewing government officials,
German government official.
German government officials, people who had come through the lines, people who knew something about the territory ahead of us, and a lot of it was gut work.
What were you interviewing them about?
What kind of uniforms did they see? We had all had order of battle training, so that if you knew what the uniform was and the signs on the shoulders and whatnot, you could build up a whole division, and from there an army, and how many were there. And at the same time, we did work with, we had, for example, a case in Belgium after the Germans were driven out of, we had heard in a small town where the Germans had come in and murdered some civilians. And through informers, we found the bodies of those 2 young, maybe 16, 18-year-old kids in the woods where they'd been shot in the back of the head. Why were they shot? They were suspected of being terrorists or anti-German, as any Belgian would be.
Let me stop you for a second.
Yeah.
And I want, as audience knows here, one of the things we talk about is the broad nature of what legal problems are. And anybody who's reading the newspapers in the last few weeks know that there's a major investigation going on in Bosnia now of war crimes. They're creating another war crimes tribunal. And people talk back again and again to the Nazi days, and not just how they dealt with the Jews, but how they dealt with other civilians, gypsies, and any kind of religious groups, etc., and the necessity to create a true tribunal so that cannot happen again. And maybe we can learn some lessons going back a little bit to find out how we dealt with individuals from that period of time. But these people who were coming out and talking to you, were these people seeking? These were Germans leaving Germany?
No, these were in Belgium. These were Belgians
Were they
and the local
sympathizers?
people.
Or they-
Absolutely. Absolutely. They were very bitter about what had happened. The Germans had come in and ruined the towns. There was a lot of fighting going on. A lot of their people were lost, and they were very happy to see the Allies come in and drive the Germans
And they
out.
described what you described, these sort of incidents where individuals were killed?
This
or-
was a particular incident where 2 young boys from this village, and we learned this from an informer, and I went out there with another interpreter and questioned them, located the bodies, and made our report back to headquarters.
And what do you think happens to those cases? Did you ever follow?
I don't know, because that went up to a war crimes tribunal that used it, and were collecting information of this sort from every source that they had.
Okay,
And,
did you get into Germany itself?
Oh, yes.
What happened
Oh,
in
yes.
there? Did you talk?
Well, there, as the war slowed down, and it looked like victory was sure, by this time we had gone from Aachen across the Rhine via Bad Godesberg. We moved very quickly through Nordhausen all the way to Leipzig. And the war, at that time, we were just rushing to get territory. And the war slowed off in terms of our work. We turned to political work, which was the main thing that we did in Germany. Who were the Nazis? Where were they? What occupation did they have? What kinds of things did they do? How do we get them out of the government? How do we get them put away out of put into jail? The Allies produced a list of Nazi political office holders by rank, and from certain ranks upward, they were automatically arrestable. There wasn't any question. I was just saying, what did you do during the war? That we had plenty of that. But and what did you do for the party, and how long were you a member of the party? These are basic questions. What was your position? What were your responsibilities? What did you do about Jews and gypsies and people and communists and people who were anti-Nazi? Did you have any experience of that kind? Do you remember?
Did these people admit
Some did.
to what they did?
Yes, some did.
How do they admit this? I mean, with any
Well,
kind of
for
guilt?
example, I had a very vivid case of a man who had been in the SR, that's the Sturmabteilung, brown shirts, in the little town of Mansfeld, not far from Leipzig. And there we were working with military government to look for these people and get them out of the circulation so that the military government could now find Germans who were anti-Nazi, who believed in democracy. And there were some who could take over the reins of government, become the mayors and the clerks and of the town. And that was the whole idea, to clear it up and to get friendly people in. This fella, I don't remember exactly how I came across him, but we interrogated him at some length because he had been a prominent member of the SR. And I asked him, were there any Jewish families in town? He says, oh, yes, there were. What happened to them? I don't know. I said, come on, you can tell me, I'm sure.
Did he know you were Jewish?
I don't know if he did or not. I didn't proclaim it, but my German, he must have suspected I was certainly American. And but he admitted that he and a bunch of his buddies had gone up to the furniture store, which the family had owned. They threw all the furniture. They lived above the furniture store on the main street of the town. They went up to the town and they threw all the furniture through the window.
This was a furniture store owned by a Jewish family?
Yes. And I said, what happened to the family? He says, I think they took them away at that point.
Who is this they?
Trucks came and
Just
took them
trucks,
away.
some neutral group.
Yeah,
they,
I hesitate to say what my reaction was at this time. It
Well, what was your
violent.
reaction?
I smacked him across the face, and I had never done that before. And I thought he was going to attack me, but I had the gun. And he finally admitted, well, they did it, and they're gone, and what happened to them, I don't know.
Now, emotionally, how did this affect you? I know you smacked him, but what were you feeling like when he told you this stuff?
Terrible.
Therefore, the grace of God would go me?
Yes, of course. I mean, and why was it done? Well, because they were Jewish. He didn't have any particular feelings about it, except that they had to go. They had to be thrown out. Well, we raided his house that night because we heard that he had hidden guns in the house somewhere, and he admitted that. We took him out of bed around midnight. We had surrounded the house with the MPs and just walked in, I suppose. But this was wartime. And he admitted that the guns had been hidden behind the chimney on the second floor of the house. And we got him a great big sledgehammer, and he hammered it in, and there the guns were. And then he admitted that he had a bust of Hitler hidden in the garden, and we had him dig that up, and there it was. And he had been, whatever his position was, he was arrestable, and he went to jail.
Now, he went to jail,
Yes.
or did he go to the War Crimes Tribunal, or did he go to jail?
No, I don't think so. I think he was small fry. These are small fry people, but dangerous in that where their loyalties were. In that sense, they were sent to jail and then moved to large, I guess we took over camps where we kept the political prisoners for some months.
But
while
we
they
know
were
that a
being
lot of these
interned.
people wound up
Yeah.
going back into high positions.
Yes,
in
some
Germany.
of them. There are only few that I met that were of that level. Kurt Schmidt was somebody I spent 2 or 3 days with.
Did you interview him?
And I interviewed him.
He was the later chancellor.
He was the Minister of Economics under Hitler
Right.
in the early 30s.
Right.
A tall, handsome, blonde, blue-eyed guy, very friendly, very nice, good English. We didn't have to speak German. His English was better than my German, probably. And he told me that he was head of the Münchner Versicherungsverein. That's the Munich reinsurance company, which became the largest insurance company in Europe due to the fact that wherever the Germans went, they took over the insurance companies, wherever it was. You name it. Whether it was Italy or Romania or France, and the company became enormous. Later on, recently in the last year, there was a letter of the Times from somebody who had sued this company because they had issued a lot of insurance policies to Jews who disappeared, and they never collected on the insurance. And this particular person writing in said it was Kurt Schmidt who established this policy. Maybe he did. In asking him what he did and did he ever know any Jewish people and what happened to them, he confessed he really didn't know. And he thought it was terrible. And he says, here is, Ambassador Dodd, your ambassador, American ambassador to Berlin in the early 30s, writes about me. And he wrote a book called, I think it was called Berlin Diary, not to be confused with William Shirer's book later on. But it says in it that Schmidt was one of the nice guys. He was really a nice fellow. He really wasn't as bad as some of the others.
When it wasn't as
So
bad.
he would go around the camp and show everybody. This was a camp that was established by the Allies north of Munich in Moosburg, where we went to work, and we spent some months there interrogating political prisoners of all kinds.
I mean, it's interesting, but put us in context. I mean, it's hard to go back to those years, and I know the people now who are watching what's going on in Bosnia and some of the other places, it's hard to put in context. You're dealing with all levels of citizens. You're dealing with the local town manager. You're dealing with people who are running the big companies, who are part of this system which has as a premise genocide and destruction of groups of people, including the Jews, where in Bosnia it's other groups as well. And their response is, almost out of Hogan's Heroes, I know nothing.
There was absolutely no sense of remorse or concern. This is what happened. This is what we were told to do. We believed in Hitler. I had a woman tell me, she was the editor of a newspaper in some town, who said he only made one mistake, losing the war.
So if Hitler had won, if Hitler had won, the world would have been different, that's
Very
for sure.
different, no question about it. And
you and I probably would not be sitting here having this conversation.
Right. I never met one, certainly no Nazis, that ever said, gee, we're sorry we did some terrible things. That never came up.
Well, we see the pictures, from all the movies of local German citizens being taken to where large numbers of bodies were buried. And the American military authorities require them to walk around and sometimes even to dig the graves and to bury them. But when they're interviewed afterwards, they say, oh, this is really horrible, this is really horrible. But there's no sense of personal responsibility.
That's correct. In Nordhausen, which was not a death camp in the sense of Auschwitz, was a slave labor camp.
Now, you were at Nordhausen?
I was at Nordhausen.
How did you end up in Nordhausen?
Well, the First Army came through there, and it was bombed by the Allies, and that was probably in April of 45, because we went through there and then went on to Leipzig. And I was in Leipzig on May 8th when peace was declared.
Now, Nordhausen was a slave...
Nordhausen was a camp where they had thousands of slave laborers, and they built V1 bombs in a huge hill next to several Red Cross hospitals. It was never bombed by the Allies. They never knew it existed. And but the Germans put up a fight, and the camp was bombed and some of the surroundings. When we got there, we were appalled. There were a number of slave laborers still alive. I talked to one, and he was in a barracks of all Jewish prisoners. And he said, "Do you know my uncle in New York?" I said, "No, I don't." He died a few minutes after that. He was that weak. But
so you saw the victims.
We saw the victims, yes, but not those who were gassed.
No, but you saw the people who they're very emaciated.
We talked to them. I've talked to a lot of them, emaciated with rags in the striped uniforms, and they talked about some of the things they had gone through. Recall, we were not that part of intelligence looking to develop information on concentration camps. Our job was somewhat different. But we were there, and we were asked to go in, see what we found, talk to people, collect some data, and move on, which is what we did.
Now, again, I have to say, how did you feel talking to these people, seeing what they look like, seeing these camps? How did it...
Appalling.
But I mean, where, you did it one day, and then you have to go back the next day and do it the next day after that? How do you live with it?
I remember my feeling that, I'd heard about this and read about it. Now I've seen it, and I think it shook me for days afterwards. But it also made me more and more determined that to see the war through, and whatever our job was, to do the best we could, so that it became almost a mission. Find who the Nazis
What about your
were.
attitude towards Germany, the German people?
Well, I'm afraid to say, because that's a long time ago now, but I was back to Germany twice in '88 and again in '89 just to see what had happened. I did not find, for the most part, any remorse. I took a trip up the Rhine to from Bonn and talked to a couple of ladies who were probably my age, teachers, very gentle, courteous German ladies, and they were telling me about all the Arabs who lived in that area. I said, "Are there any Jews living here?" She looked at me and says, "You Americans are all alike. You think we Germans are devils." I said, "Well, isn't that? I'm asking you for a reason. What happened to them all?" And she said, "Well, I don't know. No idea. No concern, really."
Well, there's
And
also...
I resented being asked the question.
And there's a large group of Germans, this generation coming, that deny that the Holocaust was as serious as it was.
But a lot of that has to do with the education that they're receiving. I think that an attempt was made sometime after the war, but not immediately, to teach what had happened in the public schools. But that probably was 20 years after the war. A friend of mine who teaches at the Freie Universität in the neighborhood of Berlin, who is not Jewish, but has studied the problem, told me that when he went to high school, there was none of this. But his younger brother, 5 or 8 years later, was getting some education. So things have been done. Improvements have been made. I think the young generation, they only know what they heard.
Now, you talked about some of the incidents you talked. Did you talk to anyone who, in fact, admitted that they had been responsible for the killing of anybody?
Yes. We talked to a lot of concentration camp guards, and they, under persistent questioning, one of them told us that, we were ordered, and it was not my fault, but we were ordered to get rid of, and these weren't Jews, he said, these were Greeks. And
that's
we had
better.
about 100
that's
of
better.
them. Yeah. Well, he didn't want to, I guess he knew I was Jewish and he didn't want to offend me. But he says, we had about 100 of them, and we did it the easy way. I said, "What do you mean by that?" He says, "We made them jump off a cliff. And then we went down and we shot those who were still alive."
That's the easy way.
Unbelievable.
And a matter of
happened.
fact, stating as a matter of fact. This is just a matter of fact.
Matter of fact. He was hoping that if he told the truth, maybe we'd let him go. Of course, we didn't let him go. There was a lot of that. I talked to many people in the Nazi Party, from Ortsgruppenleiter, small-town leaders, all the way up to Kurt Schmidt, who was a SS general. That's why he was in the camp. He had been arrested by some American soldiers who found out he was a general, and that was automatically arrestable. And he had lived through the war. I took him home. I was allowed to take him home for a day. The Allies had already decided that he was not a bad enough guy to keep for the Nuremberg trials, and they wanted to release him, but they weren't sure that they knew everything, so they said, "You go down, you spend a day with him, and you bring him back, and tell us what you see." I saw an estate of hundreds of acres with this beautiful herd of those sheep, with the curved horns, and I had lunch with his wife and his daughter and his son-in-law and the 2 little grandchildren, who were delightful and polite, as if that nothing had ever happened. There'd never been a war. And daughter had already been cleared by the Allies. She was running a paper in Munich, and her husband had spent most of the war in Switzerland running insurance matters. Those people were not touched when the war was lost, and they arrested him. It was a terrible shock.
You obviously worked with non-Jewish compatriots in the military. What was their response as compared to yours? Was it...
Well, it wasn't quite as personal, but it was the same. American boys, like, for example, I'll give you a good example. In Nordhausen, when the camp was cleared and the bodies of those who had died, concentration camp members, some had starved, some had been hurt in the bombing, were laid out, hundreds of them in rows. The Allies went to the mayor of Nordhausen, the town right outside the camp, and demanded that the townspeople come in and see what had happened. And they came in and helped to move the bodies. There were American soldiers there standing by, regular GIs from anywhere, who were shocked by what they saw. And and mad about it, furious about it, that this could have happened. The townspeople, I heard them say, as they've always said, "Wir wussten nichts." We never knew anything about this. Terrible. Didn't you know that something was going on? We didn't know anything about it. They just shut up.
Going back in reflection and putting some context, do you think, and we then had a war crimes tribunal, we said following orders is not sufficient.
That's right.
Do you think if they had known that rule before, if the German citizens or the German military leaders had known that they could be held responsible after the war, it would have had any impact? Or did they think they were going to win the war and it didn't matter?
I figured they would have. They figured they were going to win the war.
So you don't think, I mean...
It's only later on that when it looked like the place was falling apart, that they were told, say nothing, admit nothing, and get out of the concentration camps. They emptied concentration camps of people and made them march for miles anywhere they could.
I'm curious, if we now have this whole elaborate system today for establishing war crimes, asking people to volunteer. I mean, do you think it has even a marginal impact on the sort of lower level person, or is it just wishful thinking?
What do you say, lower level? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if you have someone who's asked to kill someone, as from the lieutenant. Remember Vietnam, we had Cali and all those individuals, and following orders is just not a sufficient defense. Do you think it makes those individuals stop and think?
No. I think what happened was something a little different. I went back to Corneli Munster, where we had been stationed back in '89, and I wanted to see what it was like. There wasn't a sign of the war. I met a gentleman there about my age through a storekeeper. I was asking around. She said, well, here, I've forgotten his name now, he can tell you about it, where it was. I was looking for the headquarters. Drove me around. Very nice gentleman who had been a photographer with the German army in Poland. And he said, he says, everything they say is absolutely true. I wasn't there taking the pictures of the concentration camps and the killings, but a friend of mine was. And besides, I saw the results. Absolutely true. And by the way, we found the headquarters. I couldn't see it because there was a building there I'd never seen before that had been built since the war. So we found it. And then he said, but you have to realize, and they said, we had Jewish people living here, they're gone, I don't know what happened to them, I had nothing to do with it, I want you to know. But he says, the ordinary German wasn't responsible. The Nazi Party was run by a few people at the top, and they did it. I said, come on. It took hundreds of thousands of people to run the railroads, run the camps, run the squads, be in the service, be in the SS that rounded up people, and the Abwehr that rounded up Jews and gypsies and anybody else they didn't like and threw them into the gas chambers. They were there. Who were they? Well, couldn't persuade them. Yeah. It's all Hitler's fault or Himmler's or Goebbels. And, of course, it took a long time to sink in that hundreds of thousands, if not millions. I'm not saying I agree with Hitler's Willing Executioners, the book by young Professor Goldhagen, I think it is, Harvard.
Who says that the entire population is responsible?
Yeah, well, pretty much, a lot of them. I met a lot also, because I met a lot of Germans who were non-political but kept their mouths shut and also were afraid to say.
We have run out of time. This was a very fast half hour. I want to thank Aaron Levine. I would love to have gone on for a little longer to find out what's going on and hear the stories and recollections.